Sarah Mitchell adjusted her grip on Max's harness as they approached the bustling departure gate at Denver International Airport. The golden retriever walked beside her with practiced precision, his bright orange vest clearly marking him as a service animal. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, not from nervousness about flying, but from the growing anxiety that had been building since her doctor's appointment 3 weeks ago. At 28, Sarah looked like any other young professional heading out on a business trip. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore a crisp navy blazer over dark jeans. But beneath her composed exterior, Sarah was fighting a battle that most people couldn't see. The seizures had started 6 months ago, appearing without warning and turning her once predictable life upside down. Max had been her lifeline. The specially trained seizure alert dog could detect the subtle changes in Sarah's scent and behavior that preceded an episode, giving her precious minutes to find a safe place or alert someone nearby. In the past 4 months since Max had joined her life, he had already prevented 3 potentially dangerous situations. The flight to Chicago was crucial. Sarah worked as a marketing coordinator for a nonprofit organization that helped families affected by childhood cancer. This trip would determine whether they secured a major grant that could fund their programs for the next 3 years. Her boss, Jennifer, had specifically chosen Sarah for this presentation because of her passion and knowledge about their work. As they waited in the departure lounge, Sarah noticed other passengers glancing at Max with curiosity and admiration. Children pointed excitedly at the beautiful dog, while their parents smiled and nodded approvingly. Sarah had grown accustomed to these reactions. Most people understood that service dogs were working animals and shouldn't be disturbed, though she occasionally had to politely explain Max's role to well-meaning strangers who wanted to pet him. The gate agent announced that boarding would begin in 15 minutes. Sarah pulled out her phone to review her presentation notes one final time. The PowerPoint slides were loaded with statistics about their success rates, testimonials from families they had helped, and detailed budget projections for the proposed programs. She had rehearsed this presentation dozens of times, but the stakes felt enormous. Max suddenly shifted beside her, his ears perking up slightly. Sarah recognized the subtle signal immediately. Her blood sugar was dropping, another trigger that Max had learned to identify. She quickly reached into her bag for a granola bar, grateful once again for her companion's vigilance. "Good boy," she whispered, scratching behind Max's ears. The dog's tail wagged once before he resumed his alert position, scanning their surroundings with professional focus. When the boarding announcement finally came, Sarah felt a familiar mix of excitement and nervousness. She had flown several times since getting Max, and while most airline staff were knowledgeable about service animal regulations, there were always those awkward moments of explanation and documentation review. They joined the priority boarding line, which was Sarah's right as a passenger traveling with a service animal. The flight attendant at the gate, a middle-aged woman with short blonde hair and a tired expression, barely glanced at Sarah's boarding pass before waving her through. As they walked down the jet bridge, Max maintained his perfect heel position. Sarah could feel his calm energy helping to steady her own nerves. The plane was a smaller regional aircraft with 2 seats on each side of the narrow aisle. Sarah had specifically requested a window seat in the emergency exit row to give Max more space to lie down. During the flight attendant who greeted them at the aircraft door had a different demeanor entirely. Her name tag read Linda, and her sharp eyes immediately focused on Max with unmistakable disapproval. Sarah's stomach tightened as she recognized the look she had encountered before from people who didn't understand or believe in the legitimacy of service animals. "Excuse me?" Linda said, blocking the aisle with her arm. "You can't bring that dog on this aircraft." Sarah took a deep breath, drawing on the training she had received from Max's handler about advocating for her rights. "This is my service dog," she explained calmly, gesturing to Max's clearly marked vest. "I have all the required documentation." Linda's expression didn't soften. "I don't care what kind of vest he's wearing. Dogs aren't allowed in the cabin unless they're in carriers that fit under the seat. You'll need to make arrangements to have him transported in cargo or you can't fly today." Other passengers were beginning to back up behind them, and Sarah could feel dozens of eyes watching the confrontation. Her face flushed with embarrassment and frustration. "Ma'am, service dogs are legally allowed to accompany their handlers in the cabin. This is protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Look, honey, Linda said with condescending patience. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I know the rules. That dog is too big for the cabin, and I'm not going to compromise the safety of other passengers because you want to bring your pet along." Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly, and Max immediately pressed closer to her leg, providing the deep pressure therapy he had been trained to offer during moments of stress. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood service dog behavior. "He's not a pet," Sarah said, her voice stronger now despite her rising anxiety. "Max is a medical alert dog. He detects my seizures before they happen and helps keep me safe. I have a letter from my neurologist and his training certification right here." She reached into her bag for the folder containing Max's documentation, but Linda held up her hand dismissively. "I don't need to see any papers. Company policy is clear and I'm not making exceptions. You can either make other arrangements for the dog, or you can exit the aircraft now." The captain emerged from the cockpit, drawn by the commotion in the aisle. He was an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, and Sarah felt a flutter of hope that reason might prevail. But before she could explain the situation to him, Linda launched into her version of events. "Captain Morrison, this passenger is refusing to comply with our pet policy. She's insisting on bringing this large dog into the cabin without proper arrangements." Sarah watched in dismay as the captain's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. The word pet had completely mischaracterized the situation, and she realized she was fighting an uphill battle against both ignorance and institutional bias. Behind her, passengers were beginning to murmur impatiently about the delay. Someone called out asking what the holdup was, and Sarah felt the weight of everyone's inconvenience settling on her shoulders. This was exactly the kind of public confrontation she had hoped to avoid, but she knew she couldn't back down. Too much was at stake, both for her immediate safety and for the important work waiting for her in Chicago. Captain Morrison studied the situation with growing confusion. He had been flying commercial aircraft for over 20 years and had encountered service animals numerous times without incident. Something about Linda's explanation didn't align with his understanding of federal regulations, but the flight was already running behind schedule, and he needed to resolve this quickly. "Let me see your documentation," he said to Sarah, his voice neutral but not unkind. Sarah gratefully handed over the folder containing Max's training certificates, her neurologist's letter, and a laminated card explaining her rights under the ADA. The captain reviewed the documents carefully, while Linda stood beside him with crossed arms, clearly annoyed by what she perceived as unnecessary delays. "These look legitimate," Captain Morrison said after several minutes. "Ma'am, service animals are indeed permitted in the cabin under federal law. The dog appears to be properly trained and documented." Linda's face reddened. "Captain, with all due respect, I've been following company guidelines. That animal is simply too large for our aircraft. What if there's an emergency evacuation? He could block the aisles and endanger other passengers." Sarah felt her anxiety spike as she realized Linda wasn't going to back down easily. Max sensed her distress and gently nudged her hand with his nose, a trained behavior designed to interrupt the escalating stress response that often preceded her seizures. "The law doesn't specify size restrictions for service animals," Sarah said, her voice steadier thanks to Max's calming presence. "And Max is trained for aircraft emergencies. He knows commands like under and stay that keep him out of evacuation routes." A businessman in an expensive suit pushed forward from the line of waiting passengers. "Look, we're all going to miss our connections if this goes on much longer. Can't you people figure this out?" More voices joined in, some supporting Sarah's right to travel with her service dog, others expressing frustration with the delay. The cabin filled with tension as passengers took sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Captain Morrison raised his hand for quiet. "Linda, I need you to contact the gate supervisor. We need to get company policy clarified before we make any decisions." He turned to Sarah with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry for this confusion. We should have this sorted out shortly." Linda reluctantly picked up the aircraft phone and dialed the gate. Sarah could hear her side of the conversation, which painted the situation in the worst possible light. She described Max as an enormous, potentially disruptive animal, and emphasized her concerns about passenger safety and company liability. While they waited for resolution, Sarah tried to stay calm by focusing on her breathing and Max's steady presence beside her. The dog remained perfectly still despite the chaos around him, demonstrating the exact kind of professional behavior that made him so effective as a medical alert animal. A few passengers began approaching Sarah with questions and support. An elderly woman named Dorothy shared that her grandson had autism and traveled with a service dog. A young father mentioned that his wife had epilepsy and understood how crucial medical alert animals could be. But not everyone was sympathetic. The businessman continued to complain loudly about the delay, and Sarah overheard another passenger questioning whether her disability was real enough to justify the disruption. These comments stung, but Sarah had learned to develop thick skin about public misconceptions regarding invisible disabilities. 20 minutes passed before Linda finally hung up the phone. Her expression was grim as she approached Captain Morrison and Sarah. "The supervisor says we need to follow company protocol. All animals must be approved by our Special Services Department at least 48 hours before travel. Since this wasn't prearranged, the dog cannot fly today." Sarah's heart sank. She had specifically called the airline 3 days earlier to inform them about Max and had been told that advance notification wasn't required for service animals, only for emotional support animals. She had the confirmation number from that conversation written in her planner. "I did call ahead," Sarah protested, pulling out her planner. "I spoke with someone named Marcus on Tuesday. He told me I just needed to arrive early for boarding and have my documentation ready." Linda shrugged dismissively. "I don't know anything about that conversation, and I can't verify it now. Company policy is clear, and I have to follow the supervisor's instructions." Captain Morrison looked uncomfortable with the situation, but seemed reluctant to override his flight attendant's interpretation of company policy. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry about this confusion. We can try to get you rebooked on tomorrow's flight after your service animal clearance comes through." Sarah felt tears of frustration building behind her eyes. Tomorrow would be too late. The grant presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock the next morning, and this was the last flight that would get her to Chicago in time. Months of preparation and her organization's future funding hung in the balance. "Please," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm not trying to cause problems. I just need to get to Chicago tonight. Max has flown before without any issues. I have proof that I called ahead." The standoff continued for another 10 minutes while passengers grew increasingly restless. Some began demanding to speak with supervisors themselves, frustrated that their travel plans were being disrupted by what they saw as airline incompetence. Finally, Captain Morrison made an executive decision. "I'm going to have to ask you to deplane while we sort this out properly. We can't hold up the entire flight any longer." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as the reality of the situation hit home. Max immediately pressed against her leg, sensing the physiological changes that often preceded her seizures. His alert behavior was subtle but unmistakable to anyone trained to recognize it. "She's having a medical episode," called out Dorothy, the elderly passenger who had been watching Max's behavior closely. "The dog is trying to warn her." Linda rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. This is just emotional manipulation. She's upset because she can't get her way." But Max's behavior was becoming more insistent. He positioned himself partially in front of Sarah and looked up at her with the focused intensity that meant a seizure was imminent. Sarah recognized the warning and quickly sat down in the nearest seat, following the safety protocol she had practiced countless times. The cabin fell silent as passengers realized they were witnessing exactly the kind of medical emergency that made service dogs necessary. Even Linda seemed to understand that something serious was happening, though she maintained her skeptical expression. Sarah closed her eyes and focused on the breathing techniques her neurologist had taught her. Sometimes, if she caught the warning early enough and remained calm, she could prevent the seizure from fully developing. Max lay down beside the seat and placed his head on her lap, providing the deep pressure therapy that helped regulate her nervous system. After several tense minutes, Sarah felt the warning signs begin to subside. The seizure had been averted, but the episode left her feeling drained and vulnerable. She opened her eyes to find dozens of concerned faces looking at her with new understanding of why Max was so essential to her safety and independence. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely shifted. What had started as an inconvenient delay had transformed into a moment of stark reality about the life-saving role of service animals. Several passengers who had been complaining about the holdup now looked ashamed of their earlier impatience. Dorothy moved to the seat beside Sarah and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Honey, are you all right? That dog of yours knew exactly what was happening, didn't he?" Sarah nodded weakly, still recovering from the near-seizure episode. "Max gives me about 3 to 5 minutes of warning. If I hadn't been able to sit down and calm myself, I could have had a full tonic-clonic seizure right here in the aisle." Captain Morrison's expression had changed dramatically. The documentation in his hands suddenly carried much more weight as he witnessed firsthand the medical necessity of Max's presence. "Ma'am, I apologize for what you've been through. This should never have escalated to this point." Linda, however, remained unmoved by the demonstration. "Look, I understand this is emotional for everyone, but we still have company policies to follow. I can't just ignore the rules because of one incident." The businessman who had been complaining earlier stepped forward, his expensive suit and authoritative demeanor commanding attention. "Actually, you can ignore your company's policies when they violate federal law. I'm an attorney, and what I've witnessed here tonight could result in a substantial lawsuit under the Americans with Disabilities Act." He handed Sarah his business card. "My name is Robert Chen, and I specialize in disability rights cases. What this airline is doing to you is textbook discrimination, and you have every right to seek legal recourse." Linda's confidence finally began to waver as she realized the legal implications of the situation. "I'm just following the training I received. Nobody ever told me about exceptions for medical alert dogs." "That's exactly the problem," Robert said firmly. "The law doesn't recognize different categories of service animals. A guide dog for the blind has the same rights as a seizure alert dog or a diabetes detection dog. Your training was inadequate and your airline is liable for the discrimination." Captain Morrison rubbed his temples, clearly feeling caught between conflicting directives. "Let me try calling the supervisor again. Maybe we can get some clarity on this situation." While the captain made his call, other passengers began sharing their own stories and experiences. A nurse named Patricia explained that she had worked with epilepsy patients and understood how unpredictable seizures could be. A teacher named James talked about a student in his class who had a service dog for anxiety-related medical conditions. The conversation revealed how little most people understood about the variety of conditions that service dogs could assist with. Many passengers had assumed that only guide dogs for the blind were real service animals, not realizing the extensive training that dogs like Max underwent to detect medical emergencies. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the unexpected support from strangers, but also emotionally drained from the confrontation and near seizure. Max remained attentively by her side, occasionally checking her pulse and scent for any signs of continued distress. Captain Morrison returned from his call looking frustrated and confused. "The supervisor is now saying that our Special Services Department should have been notified, but she's also acknowledging that federal law supersedes company policy. She's trying to reach someone higher up the chain for guidance. How long is this going to take?" asked a mother traveling with 2 young children. "My kids have school tomorrow and we've already been delayed for over an hour." The domino effect of the situation was becoming clear. The delay wasn't just affecting Sarah's important business trip, but dozens of other passengers with their own urgent travel needs. Flight connections were being missed, hotel reservations were at risk, and the airline's entire evening schedule was being disrupted. Linda seemed to recognize that her initial hardline stance was causing far more problems than it solved. "Maybe we could try seating them in a different part of the aircraft, somewhere with more space?" "The dog doesn't need more space," Patricia, the nurse, interjected. "Service dogs are trained to work in confined areas. That's the whole point of their training." Robert, the attorney, nodded in agreement. "The law is very clear that service animals must be allowed to accompany their handlers wherever passengers are normally permitted to go. You can't segregate them to specific sections of the aircraft." Sarah watched this debate swirl around her, feeling increasingly like a spectacle rather than a person with legitimate travel needs. The attention was well-meaning, but she just wanted to get to Chicago quietly and focus on her presentation preparation. "I appreciate everyone's support," Sarah said softly, "but I'm wondering if we could find a practical solution that gets everyone to their destinations. I don't want to cause more delays for other passengers." Her willingness to compromise despite being clearly in the right seemed to shame Linda into reconsidering her position. The flight attendant had been digging in her heels partly out of embarrassment at being corrected in front of passengers, but Sarah's graciousness provided an opportunity for face-saving resolution. "What if we try this?" Captain Morrison suggested. Sarah, you and Max take your assigned seats and we'll monitor the situation during flight. If there are any actual safety concerns, we can address them then. But based on what I've seen, this dog is extremely well trained and poses no threat to passenger safety. Linda looked like she wanted to object, but the captain's tone made it clear that this was a decision, not a discussion. I suppose we could try that approach, she said reluctantly. As passengers began settling back into their seats for boarding, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The confrontation had been emotionally draining, and she still faced the challenge of delivering a crucial presentation the next morning on minimal sleep and high stress. Max seemed to sense that the immediate crisis had passed and began displaying some of his off-duty behaviors for the first time in over an hour. His tail wagged slightly as Sarah scratched behind his ears, and he looked around the cabin with curiosity rather than the intense focus he maintained during medical alerts. He's beautiful, Dorothy commented as she passed by on her way to her seat. My grandson's service dog saved his life more times than I can count. People just don't understand how important these animals are. As Sarah finally settled into her window seat with Max curled up at her feet, she pulled out her phone to call her boss, Jennifer. She needed to explain why she was running late and might not have time for their planned practice session before the presentation. The call would open up another layer of complications she hadn't anticipated, but for now, Sarah allowed herself a moment of gratitude that she and Max were finally on their way to Chicago. The real test of their journey, however, was just beginning. The plane finally took off 2 hours behind schedule, and Sarah felt some of her tension ease as they climbed into the night sky. Max had settled comfortably at her feet, occasionally lifting his head to check on her but otherwise resting peacefully. The flight attendant Linda had maintained a professional but distant demeanor during the safety demonstration, avoiding eye contact with Sarah whenever possible. Sarah pulled out her phone to call Jennifer before they reached cruising altitude, and the signal disappeared. Her boss answered on the second ring, sounding concerned. Sarah, I was starting to worry. Your flight was supposed to land an hour ago. Are you okay? Sarah explained the situation at the airport, trying to keep her voice low to avoid disturbing other passengers. Jennifer listened with growing alarm as the story unfolded. They actually tried to prevent Max from flying with you. Sarah, that's completely unacceptable. We need to file a formal complaint with the airline and possibly pursue legal action. I just want to focus on the presentation right now, Sarah said wearily. We can deal with the airline issues later, but I'm going to be exhausted when I land and I won't have time for our practice session. Jennifer's voice softened with concern. Honey, are you sure you're up for this presentation tomorrow? After what you've been through tonight plus the stress of a delayed flight, maybe we should postpone. No, Sarah said firmly. This grant is too important. The families we serve can't wait for us to reschedule because I had a bad travel day. I'll be fine once I get some rest. But even as Sarah spoke the words, she could feel the lingering effects of the near-seizure episode and the emotional exhaustion from the confrontation. Max seemed to sense her elevated stress levels and shifted position to provide more contact with her leg, his way of offering comfort and monitoring her condition. After ending the call with Jennifer, Sarah tried to review her presentation materials on her laptop, but the words seemed to blur together. The combination of stress, fatigue, and the confined airplane environment was triggering warning signs that Max immediately detected. The dog's posture changed subtly, and he began the alert sequence that Sarah had learned to recognize. His ears pricked forward, and he placed his paw gently on her foot. Sarah quickly saved her work and closed the laptop, focusing on the breathing exercises that sometimes helped prevent seizures from developing. Dorothy, who was sitting across the aisle, noticed Max's behavior change. Is everything all right, dear? Your dog seems concerned about something. He's giving me a seizure warning, Sarah whispered. I need to stay calm and wait it out. Word spread quietly through their section of the plane that Sarah was having another medical episode. The passengers who had witnessed the earlier incident at the gate now understood exactly why Max's presence was so crucial. Instead of being disruptive, the dog was providing life-saving medical monitoring that allowed Sarah to travel safely. Linda approached from the front of the cabin, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal awkwardness. Is there anything we can do to help? She asked quietly. Sarah was surprised by the offer, given Linda's earlier hostility. I just need to stay seated and keep calm. Max will let me know when the danger passes. For the next 15 minutes, Max maintained his alert position while Sarah practiced the stress reduction techniques her neurologist had taught her. The cabin crew dimmed the lights for the remainder of the flight, creating a calmer environment that helped Sarah's nervous system settle. Gradually, Max's posture relaxed, indicating that the seizure threat was subsiding. Sarah felt the familiar wave of relief and gratitude that followed these episodes. Without Max's early warning system, she would have had no way to prepare for or prevent the seizure, which could have been dangerous in the confined space of an aircraft. As they began their descent into Chicago, Linda approached Sarah's seat again. This time, her demeanor was completely different from the confrontational attitude she had displayed at the gate. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," Linda said quietly. "I've been a flight attendant for 15 years and I thought I understood all the rules about service animals. But I've never seen anything like what your dog does for you. I was wrong to give you such a hard time, and I'm sorry." Sarah was touched by the unexpected apology. "I understand that it's not something most people encounter regularly. Max's job isn't as obvious as a guide dog's work, but it's just as important for my safety. Would you mind if I asked about his training?" Linda continued. "I'd like to better understand what to look for, so I can help other passengers who might travel with medical alert dogs." Sarah spent the remainder of the descent explaining Max's training process and the specific behaviors he displayed during different types of medical alerts. Linda listened intently, taking notes on a small pad she pulled from her pocket. "We received training about service animals," Linda explained, "but it's very basic and focuses mainly on guide dogs and mobility assistance dogs. Nobody ever explained that dogs could detect medical conditions or that seizure alerts were a real thing." The conversation revealed a systemic problem with airline employee education about the full scope of service animal capabilities. Linda's initial resistance hadn't been malicious but rather based on incomplete understanding of federal disability laws and the variety of conditions that service animals could assist with. When they landed in Chicago, the pilot made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for tonight's departure delay. We encountered some confusion regarding federal regulations for service animals that has been resolved. I want to commend our passenger Sarah and her service dog Max for their patience and professionalism during this difficult situation." The announcement drew applause from passengers throughout the cabin, many of whom had been moved by witnessing Max's medical alert capabilities firsthand. Sarah felt embarrassed by the attention, but also grateful that the experience might help other service animal handlers who encountered similar situations in the future. As they deplaned, Robert the attorney handed Sarah his card again. "I meant what I said earlier about the legal implications of what happened tonight. Even though it worked out in the end, the airline's initial response violated your civil rights. You might want to consider filing a complaint to prevent this from happening to other people." Dorothy gave Sarah a warm hug before heading to her connection. "You take care of yourself, dear. That dog of yours is a treasure, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The outpouring of support from fellow passengers had transformed what could have been a traumatic experience into something more positive. Sarah realized that by standing up for her rights and educating people about Max's role, she had potentially made future travel easier for other service animal handlers. But as she and Max made their way through the airport to catch a taxi to her hotel, Sarah felt the weight of the next day's presentation pressing down on her. She had less than 8 hours to rest before delivering the most important presentation of her career, and the stress of the travel ordeal had left her feeling drained and unprepared. Max walked beside her with renewed alertness as they entered the bustling Chicago airport terminal, ready to guide her safely through whatever challenges lay ahead. Sarah's hotel room was small but comfortable, with a view of downtown Chicago's glittering skyline. It was nearly midnight when she and Max finally settled in, and she had to be at the foundation offices by 9 o'clock the next morning. Her presentation was scheduled for 10, giving her just enough time to set up her materials and meet with the grant committee. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah's mind was racing with anxiety about the upcoming presentation. She had prepared thoroughly for months, but the airline incident had shaken her confidence and left her feeling emotionally drained. Max seemed to sense her agitation and positioned himself close to her bed, maintaining the vigilant watch that had become second nature to him. Sarah tried to review her presentation one more time, But the words on her laptop screen kept blurring together. Her stress levels were climbing again, triggering the physiological changes that Max was trained to detect. Within minutes, the dog was alerting her to another potential seizure. This time, Sarah was better prepared. She immediately stopped working, turned off the lights, and focused on the calming techniques that helped regulate her nervous system. Max provided deep pressure therapy by carefully lying across her legs, his weight and warmth helping to ground her during the episode. After 20 minutes, the warning signs subsided, but Sarah realized she needed to prioritize rest over last-minute preparation. She had done everything possible to prepare for this presentation, and cramming at midnight would only increase her stress and seizure risk. The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, matching Sarah's uncertain mood. She woke up feeling more rested than expected, but the pressure of the day ahead weighed heavily on her mind. Max had slept peacefully beside her bed, but he was immediately alert and attentive when she stirred. Sarah chose her outfit carefully, settling on a professional navy dress with a blazer that projected confidence and competence. Max's orange service vest was freshly brushed and spotless, presenting the professional image that would help him be accepted in the business environment they were entering. The taxi ride to the Brennan Children's Foundation offices gave Sarah time to review her talking points one final time. The foundation was one of the largest funders of childhood cancer support programs in the Midwest, and their grant could provide 3 years of stable funding for Sarah's organization. The foundation's offices were housed in a sleek glass building in downtown Chicago. As Sarah and Max approached the reception desk, she noticed the security guard's eyes immediately focus on Max's service vest. Unlike the airline staff, he seemed to understand immediately that Max was a working animal and simply nodded respectfully as they passed. "Good morning," said the receptionist, a friendly woman in her 50s. "You must be Sarah Mitchell from the Hope for Tomorrow Foundation. Mr. Davidson and the grant committee are looking forward to your presentation." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness at the mention of Mr. Davidson, the foundation's director. She had researched him extensively and knew he had a reputation for asking tough questions about program effectiveness and financial accountability. Her presentation would need to be flawless to impress him. "Would you like some coffee or water before the meeting?" the receptionist asked. "You have about 15 minutes before they're ready for you." Sarah gratefully accepted a bottle of water, knowing that staying hydrated helped prevent some of her seizure triggers. Max settled beside her chair in the waiting area, automatically positioning himself where he could monitor her stress levels while staying out of the way of foot traffic. As they waited, Sarah observed the steady stream of foundation staff moving through the lobby. She noticed several people glancing curiously at Max, but with the kind of respectful interest that indicated they understood his role. The foundation's work with sick children had apparently given their staff greater awareness of disability issues and adaptive equipment. At exactly 9:45, a tall man in an expensive suit approached the waiting area. "Ms. Mitchell? I'm David Davidson, the foundation director. Thank you for coming all this way to meet with us." Sarah stood to shake his hand, immediately noticing his warm smile and genuine demeanor. "Thank you for considering our application. Mr. Davidson, I'm excited to share what we've been able to accomplish with previous grants." Mr. Davidson's eyes briefly acknowledged Max, but without any of the skepticism or questions that Sarah had learned to expect. "I see you're traveling with a service dog. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make the presentation space more comfortable for both of you." The conference room was spacious and well lit, with a large table that seated 12 committee members. Sarah set up her laptop and presentation materials, while Max settled quietly beside her chair. The grant committee filed in over the next few minutes, representing various aspects of the foundation's work, including medical professionals, social workers, and community advocates. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Davidson began, "we're here to consider a 3-year grant application from the Hope for Tomorrow Foundation. Ms. Mitchell will be presenting their proposal for expanding their family support programs." Sarah stood to begin her presentation, feeling the familiar mix of nervousness and excitement that came with high-stakes situations. Max immediately adjusted his position to better monitor her stress levels, a subtle movement that only Sarah noticed. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I coordinate the Family Services Program at Hope for Tomorrow For the past 5 years, we've been providing comprehensive support to families dealing with childhood cancer diagnoses. As Sarah began presenting the statistics and success stories from their program, she felt her confidence returning. This was work she was passionate about, and her genuine enthusiasm for helping families came through clearly in her voice and demeanor. She clicked through slides showing their program outcomes: a 60% reduction in family financial stress, improved treatment compliance rates among children who received their support services, and consistently high satisfaction ratings from both families and medical professionals. One of our most successful initiatives has been our Emergency Assistance Fund, Sarah explained. When a child is diagnosed with cancer, families often face immediate financial crises from lost work time, travel expenses for treatment, and unexpected medical costs. Mr. Davidson leaned forward with interest. Can you give us some specific examples of how this assistance has made a difference? Sarah smiled, grateful for the opportunity to share real stories. Absolutely. Last month, we helped a single mother named Maria, whose 8-year-old daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. Maria had to quit her job to manage her daughter's treatment schedule, and within 2 weeks she was facing eviction. She continued with Maria's story, explaining how their emergency assistance fund had covered rent for 3 months while helping Maria apply for longer-term financial aid. Their family advocate had also connected Maria with transportation services to get to medical appointments and childcare for her other children during treatment days. The result, Sarah concluded, was that Maria's daughter never missed a treatment appointment. Her medical team reported excellent family compliance with the treatment protocol, and Maria was able to maintain stable housing throughout the most critical phase of treatment. The committee members were taking notes and nodding approvingly as Sarah presented case study after case study. Her preparation was evident in the detailed data she provided and her ability to answer technical questions about their program implementation. Halfway through the presentation, Sarah noticed Max's subtle alert signals beginning again. Her stress levels were rising as she approached the most critical part of her presentation: the budget justification and sustainability plan that would make or break their grant application. Max's gentle pressure against her leg helped ground her as she transitioned to the financial section of her presentation. The requested grant of $450,000 over 3 years would allow us to expand our services to serve 200 additional families annually. The numbers were substantial, but Sarah had done her homework on program costs and administrative efficiency. Their overhead rates were below 20%, meaning that more than 80 cents of every dollar went directly to family services. As Sarah presented the sustainability section of her proposal, she felt Max's alertness intensify. The stress of delivering such a crucial presentation was triggering the physiological changes that preceded her seizures, but she was so close to finishing that she pushed forward with determination. Our sustainability plan includes diversified funding streams, Sarah explained, clicking to her final slides. We've secured commitments from 3 local businesses for ongoing support, and we're developing a monthly donor program that should generate $40,000 annually by year 3. Mr. Davidson and several committee members were asking detailed questions about their fundraising projections when Max's alert behavior became more pronounced. He stood up beside Sarah's chair and gently touched her hand with his nose, the signal that meant she had less than 3 minutes before a seizure was likely to occur. Sarah felt her heart race as she realized the timing couldn't be worse. She was literally minutes away from completing the most important presentation of her career, but she couldn't ignore Max's warning. The consequences of having a seizure in front of the grant committee could be catastrophic for both her personal safety and their funding prospects. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her voice slightly strained as she struggled to maintain her composure. "I need to take a brief break. My service dog is alerting me to a medical issue that requires immediate attention." The room fell silent as committee members processed what was happening. Mr. Davidson immediately stood up with concern. "Of course. Is there anything we can do to help? Should we call for medical assistance?" "No, thank you," Sarah managed to say as she quickly sat down in her chair. "Max is trained to detect my seizures before they happen. I just need a few minutes to use the techniques that sometimes prevent them from developing." Sarah closed her eyes and began the deep breathing exercises that had helped her earlier on the plane. Max immediately moved into position beside her chair, providing the deep pressure therapy that helped regulate her nervous system during these episodes. The grant committee watched in fascination as Max performed his trained medical response. His behavior was calm but intensely focused, monitoring Sarah's breathing and heart rate while providing the physical contact that helped interrupt the seizure process. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, one of the medical professionals on the committee, leaned forward with professional interest. "I've heard about seizure alert dogs, but I've never seen one working. This is remarkable." For 10 tense minutes, the conference room remained quiet except for Sarah's controlled breathing and Max's occasional repositioning as he monitored her condition. Sarah could feel the familiar warning signs gradually subsiding as her stress levels decreased and her nervous system stabilized. When she finally opened her eyes, she found 12 pairs of concerned faces looking at her with a mixture of worry and admiration. Max's tail wagged once as he sensed that the immediate danger had passed. Then he returned to his professional alertness. "I'm sorry for the interruption," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "This is exactly why Max is so essential to my safety and independence. Without his early warning system, I would have had a full tonic-clonic seizure right here in your conference room." Mr. Davidson shook his head in amazement. "Please don't apologize. What we just witnessed was extraordinary. Your dog literally prevented a medical emergency." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the committee's understanding response. Instead of being viewed as a liability or disruption, her seizure episode had demonstrated exactly the kind of resilience and adaptation that made her effective in her work with families facing medical crises. "If you're feeling up to it," said Dr. Rodriguez, "I'd love to hear more about how you manage your condition while doing such demanding work. Many of the families we serve are dealing with their own health challenges, alongside their children's illnesses." Sarah realized that her personal experience with disability had suddenly become an asset rather than a potential barrier to funding. "Actually, having epilepsy has made me a more effective advocate for the families we serve. I understand firsthand how medical conditions affect not just the patient, but entire families." She spent the next 20 minutes answering questions about disability accommodation, workplace safety, and the broader implications of their support services for families dealing with multiple health challenges. The conversation had evolved beyond a simple grant application into a deeper discussion about inclusive program design and accessibility. When the formal presentation concluded, Mr. Davidson walked Sarah and Max to the elevator. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that your presentation today was exceptional, not despite your medical episode, but because of how you handled it. The grace and professionalism you showed under pressure tells us everything we need to know about your character and capabilities." Sarah felt tears of relief and gratitude welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for understanding. I was terrified that having a seizure alert during the presentation would hurt our chances for funding." "On the contrary," Mr. Davidson replied. "Watching you and Max work together gave us confidence that you have the skills and support systems necessary to manage challenging situations. That's exactly what we want to see in our grant recipients." The elevator doors opened, and as Sarah and Max stepped inside, Mr. Davidson added, "You should expect to hear from us within 2 weeks. But I can tell you unofficially that the committee was very impressed with your proposal and your presentation." During the taxi ride back to the airport, Sarah called Jennifer with the good news. Her boss was thrilled to hear that the presentation had gone well despite the medical episode, and even more excited about Mr. Davidson's positive feedback. "Sarah, I'm so proud of how you handled everything," Jennifer said. "From the airline discrimination to the seizure during the presentation, you've shown incredible strength and professionalism." As their plane lifted off from Chicago, Sarah reflected on the past 24 hours. What had started as a nightmare scenario with the airline's refusal to accommodate Max had ultimately led to educational opportunities and increased awareness about service, animals, and disability rights. She pulled out her laptop and began drafting an email to the airline's customer service department, not to complain, but to offer feedback on improving their staff training about service animal regulations. Linda, the flight attendant, had requested information about medical alert dogs, and Sarah wanted to follow through on that educational opportunity. Max slept peacefully at her feet during the flight home. Exhausted from his vigilant monitoring over the past day, Sarah watched the sunset through the airplane window and felt grateful for the partnership that had made her independence and career success possible. 2 weeks later, Sarah received the call she had been hoping for. The Brennan Children's Foundation had approved their grant application in full, providing 3 years of funding that would allow them to expand their services to hundreds of additional families. Mr. Davidson mentioned during the call that several committee members had been so impressed by Max's demonstration that they were considering funding research into service animal programs for families dealing with medical crises. Sarah's challenging travel experience had ultimately opened doors to opportunities she never could have imagined. The airline also followed up on her feedback email, inviting Sarah to participate in developing improved training materials for their staff about service animal regulations and medical alert dogs. Linda had volunteered to help pilot the new training program, turning her initial misconceptions into a commitment to better serve passengers with disabilities. As Sarah hung up the phone and shared the good news with Max, she realized that their difficult journey had created positive changes that would benefit many other service animal teams in the future. Sometimes the most challenging experiences become the catalyst for the most meaningful progress.